In Maine, the designer woman adjusted a shop window while the rich man watched. Morning along this stretch of the Maine coast did not arrive all at once. It edged in. Gray light pressed against the buildings without deciding to stay. Fog sat low enough to soften sound, high enough to let movement be noticed. The harbor was there without being seen, its presence marked by the steady breath of water against wood. Inside a narrow tailoring shop near the curve of the coastal road, Iris Calder stood just behind the front glass. One hand rested on the window frame, worn smooth where others had stood before her. With the other, she lifted the edge of a linen panel by less than an inch. Not enough to change the display for anyone walking past. Enough to change how the light settled. She stepped back, waited, adjusted it again. The fabric caught the morning light, then let it go. The reflection shifted. The imbalance corrected itself quietly, without calling attention to the effort that made it happen. Outside, the street paused. Across the road, where the sidewalk widened near a closed bookstore, Caleb Rowan stood still. He had stopped without signaling it to anyone. His coat was buttoned against the damp. His hands were empty at his sides. He did not lean. He did not check the window for detail. He watched the glass, not the woman behind it. A pickup truck moved through the space between them, tires hissing on wet pavement. The sound filled the street, then thinned. When it passed, the distance remained exactly as it had been. Inside, Iris reached toward a small brass hook fixed near the edge of the frame. It was bare. Her fingers hovered, then lowered. She left it empty. The choice registered only in her hands. A card rested in the corner of the window. No price, no description, just a single stitched mark pressed into the paper, faint enough to miss unless you were already close. The bell over the door did not ring. No one entered. For a moment, her reflection layered with the faint outline of the man across the street. Fog, glass, and distance held them together, then separated them again as she shifted her weight. She looked up. Caleb met her eyes. The look did not hold. It did not ask to be returned. It registered, then released, the way water pulls back from a dock without carrying anything with it. Iris did not smile. She did not look away. She lifted her hand once, not toward him, but toward the corner of the display where the light had slipped again. The motion was small, complete. When she lowered her hand, the window held its balance. Caleb nodded, as if to the glass itself. Then he stepped back half a pace. He did not cross the street. He did not leave. The fog shifted, thinning near the ground, thickening higher up. A gull cried somewhere out of sight, the sound stretched by distance. A woman walking her dog slowed near the curb. She looked at the window, then at the man, then back at the window again. The dog pulled forward impatient. She said nothing and moved on. Inside, Iris turned from the glass and returned to the work table. She opened her notebook, then closed it without writing. The heater clicked on briefly, then off. Outside, Caleb glanced at his watch. Not because he was late, because time had passed. The street resumed its quiet motion. A door opened farther down. Someone swept a step, knowing the wind would undo it. The harbor continued its even rhythm just beyond sight. Later, people would remember the dress, or the fog, or the way the morning felt heavier than usual. Few would remember the exact distance between the window and the sidewalk. Fewer still would remember that no one crossed it. But the space had been seen, not commented on, not claimed. In a town practiced at looking without intervening, that was enough to let the day continue. The town carried on the way it always had, without marking what had just happened. Morning spread slowly along the coast. The fog did not lift so much as thin, pulling back in narrow bands that revealed the road and then softened it again. The air stayed cold and damp, the kind that settled into wool and wood and stayed there. Wind came off the water and low, steady pulses slipping under collars, finding the gap between sleeve and glove, leaving salt on lips without asking. Down by the harbor, the water moved in an even rhythm. No crashing surf, no sarbrax, just the sound of waves pressing against pilings, then easing away again. Ropes creaked softly where they rubbed against worn wood. Nets hung stiff with salt, catching the light in dull threads. A gull cried somewhere farther out. The sound stretched thin by distance. You could not always see the bird. You could always hear that it was there. The road curved with the shoreline instead of cutting across it. It bent around small rises, dipped toward the water, then climbed again, trusting the land more than a straight line. Houses followed the same logic. Weathered wood, paint softened by years of salt and wind. Porch railings worn smooth where hands had rested through seasons that did not bother to distinguish themselves much anymore. Most mornings began in small, practical pieces. A diner door opened and closed. A bell rang once, then stopped. Chairs scraped. Coffee filled cups. Someone swept a sidewalk, knowing the wind would undo it before noon. A pickup rolled by with its headlights still on, even though it was already day. Inside the diner, heat gathered unevenly. Steam rose from mugs and disappeared near the ceiling. Conversation stayed low, not out of secrecy, but habit. Names were used sparingly, like tools you put down once the job was done. The town recognized faces before it recognized stories. At the edge of the harbor, a man checked a line and tied it again, tighter than before. Another stepped around him without comment. Work happened this way. Not announced. Not acknowledged beyond what was necessary to keep it moving. The shop windows along the main stretch reflected more than they revealed. Glass held fog, light, and the faint shapes of people passing. You could see in if the angle was right, if the light settled the way it needed to. Otherwise, the street saw itself instead. Inside her shop, Iris Calder worked with a window crack just enough to let air move through. The smell of warmed fabric and iron mixed with the briny trace that crept through old frames no matter how often you sealed them. The work table sat close to the glass, not for display, but for daylight, the kind that made stitch lines easier to judge without turning everything into glare. People treated the place like a necessity, not a destination. A hem fixed before Sunday. A zipper replaced before the first real cold snap. A coat seam reinforced before the winter wind found it. They came in, set an item down, said what it needed, and did not add more words than required. Iris listened. She nodded. She did the work. No questions that would make someone feel examined. No comments meant to turn labor into performance. Outside, Caleb Rowan moved through town without disturbing its shape. He walked routes that made sense to him. The same curve along the road. The same pause near the dock. Hands his coat pockets. Steps even. He was not the only quiet person here. Maine had plenty of those. What stood out was how little he asked the town to notice him, and how little the town pressed him to explain himself. No one asked where he was from. That was not politeness. That was boundary. If you stayed long enough, people learned you the way they learned weather. By pattern. By consistency. By what you did not disrupt. The morning continued. Drizzle came and went without committing to rain, leaving a sheen on pavement and darkening the boards along the dock. The light stayed gray, not stormy, not clear, just undecided. Winter light never warmed anything fully. It showed shapes and moved on. At the grocery store, all stayed narrow. Bread was stacked low. Apples were chosen by hand, turned once, then set down. At the register, a receipt slid across the counter. Fingers did not touch. Outside, the air felt no different than before. At the library, the building stayed cool longer than most. Books were returned without comment. Others were taken down by weight and feel rather than title. Pages turned slowly until the light shifted enough to reach the table. That was enough to know when to leave. Near the post office, a bench waited for people who needed it. Paint peeled where it always had. The wood held. Somewhere along the street, a door stayed open longer than usual, then closed. A radio played low and was turned off again. A dog barked once and stopped. Nothing here asked to be improved. The town did not resist change. It simply required it to arrive quietly. Later in the morning, someone passing the tailor shop slowed for half a second, looked at the window, looked at the street reflected in it, moved on. The pause did not become a story. It did not need to. By the time the fog lifted in patches, the harbor showed itself more clearly. The water brightened under light that never fully committed. Boats moved in and out. The road curved out of sight and returned again in another bend. Iris kept working. Caleb kept moving. If someone had been watching closely, They might have noticed how the town absorbed both of them without rearranging itself. How work continued. How space was held. How nothing demanded a response. The day made room without comment. And if a detail lingered longer than usual in someone's attention, it did not ask to be explained yet. Caleb Rowan woke before the day made up its mind. The sky outside his window was still gray, not dark, not yet morning. The ocean sounded closer at that hour, its steady movement carrying through the thin seams of the house. He lay still for a moment, listening, not counting time, letting the sound arrive and pass again. When he stood, the floor was cold. He crossed the small room without turning on a light and opened the window wider. Damp air moved in, carrying salt and the faint metallic smell of tide-wet stone. It did not wake the room so much as settle into it. In the kitchen, he set water on the stove and reached for the coffee. Whole beans, kept in a plain jar. He measured them by habit, not by scale. The grinder filled the space with a low, even sound. When the water reached temperature, he poured it into the French press, stirred once, and stepped back. He did not watch it steep. While the coffee worked on its own, he sat at the small table near the window and opened his notebook. The pages were thick, slightly rough. He wrote a few lines, not full sentences, a note about a hinge that had started to catch, a reminder to check a seam on his jacket, a quick sketch of a knot he had seen used differently at the dock the day before. When the page felt complete, he closed the notebook. The coffee was ready. He poured it into a single mug and carried it to the chair facing the water. From there, the ocean filled the frame whether he looked directly at it or not. The light had shifted just enough to show long, unbroken lines moving across the surface. No, whitecaps. No spectacle. He drank slowly. When the mug was empty, he rinsed it and set it upside down to dry. Then he pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The coastal path was damp from overnight mist. Grass bent under the weight of moisture. Pebbles pressed into the dirt where others had walked before him. He followed the curve of the land without adjusting his pace, boots finding ground they already knew. Farther along, near a low stretch of rock that dipped toward the water, a small group of harbor seals rested together. Their bodies lay close, dark shapes against darker stone. One lifted its head briefly when Caleb approached, then settled again. He sat on a piece of driftwood a short distance away. He did not move closer. He did not raise a phone. He stayed and watched the water move around them, tracing the same pattern again and again until it stopped feeling like time passing at all. When he stood, cold had worked its way into his legs. He welcomed it. By the time he reached town, the morning had taken shape. The dock was awake now. Boats idled low, engines sounding almost restrained. Ropes creaked against pilings. Nets hung stiff with salt, catching the light in dull threads. A fisherman lifted a crate and set it down again, shifting its weight by inches until it sat flat. Caleb stood near the edge of the pier and watched. He did not step in unless asked. When a line tangled around a cleat, he crouched to free it and handed it back without comment. The man took it and nodded once, already focused on the next task. At the diner, Caleb took his usual seat near the counter. Eggs, toast, coffee refilled without asking. He ate slowly, not reading the paper, not filling the space with talk. The room moved around him, voices rising and falling without anchoring anywhere. Afterward, he walked to the grocery store. The aisles were narrow. He picked up bread, soup apples. He turned each apple once before placing it in the basket. At the register, the clerk slid the receipt across the counter. Their fingers did not touch. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, still damp, still gray. He stopped by the repair shop next. A jacket seam had begun to pull at the shoulder. He handed it over, pointed out the spot, and listened while the owner examined it. No ruse, no negotiation. He would pick it up when it was ready. From there, he went to the library. The building stayed cool longer than most. He returned a book and chose another from the shelf without reading the back. He selected it by weight, by how it fit his hand. He sat at a table near the window and read until the light shifted enough to reach the page. That was his signal. He left before the room warmed. Back at the cottage, he worked with his hands. A loose hinge on the back door protested briefly, then settled once tightened. A small tear in his sweater took a few careful stitches, the repair visible but clean. He set the sweater aside and swept the porch, pushing damp leaves into a corner where the wind would eventually reclaim them. The afternoon passed without interruption. Sometimes he walked the beach again. Sometimes he stood near the water longer than planned, watching waves flatten and reform without urgency. When the wind picked up sharply, he closed the windows and listened to it press against the walls. On Sundays, he went to the church. He arrived after the service had begun and slipped into the back pew. The wood creaked softly under his weight. Light filtered through tall windows in narrow bands, settling on worn floors and old hymnals. He did not bow his head. He did not speak. No prayer spoken. No doctrine. Only wood, light, and the back pew. He stayed until the room felt settled, then left the way he came. In the evenings, when the town pulled inward again, Caleb sometimes went to the small bar near the harbor. He ordered soup or one drink and took a seat where he could listen without being drawn into conversation. If a chair wobbled, he tightened it. If a door stuck, he adjusted the latch. He did not announce the fixes. He paid and left. The routine did not belong only to him. It crossed paths with others without claiming them. The fisherman who nodded once. The clerk who remembered his order. The librarian who slid a book across the counter without comment. The man at the dock who accepted a handed rope and went back to work. The town absorbed his presence the way it absorbed weather. Morning after morning, the same places held, the same movements repeated, not to mark time, not to change anything, just to keep what was already there from breaking. And if someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how Caleb's days moved through the town with quiet discipline, how his capacity showed itself only when something needed to be steadied, then disappeared again. The ocean stayed even. The town kept its rhythm, and Caleb Rowan moved within it, without display, letting the routine do what it did best. Hold. She did not arrive as someone new. Iris Calder had already been part of the town long before Caleb Rowan registered her as a person rather than a pattern. People here knew her the way they knew tides and shop hours. Not by introduction, by repetition. She was the one who unlocked her workshop early, the one who bought thread in small quantities, the one whose lights sometimes stayed on later than expected, without explanation. Caleb first noticed her clearly on a morning that did not mark itself. Fog hung low over the street, thinning and thickening without deciding to lift. The air was cold and damp, the kind that settled into coats and stayed there. Caleb stood outside the grocery store, adjusting the weight of a paper bag in his hand, when he saw her near the bike rack. She was securing a bundle of fabric to the back of her bicycle. Her hands moved with practiced economy. Pull. Loop. Check. The wind lifted one loose corner, and she caught it without looking, fingers closing around the cloth as if it had always been part of the motion. She tightened the strap once more and stopped. It would hold. Caleb waited a few steps away, not because he had to, but because the space asked for it. He did not hurry her. She did not speed up because he was there. When she stepped back, she noticed in the way people here noticed most things. Without surprise, without pause, her eyes lifted, met his briefly, then moved on. She gave a small nod, not a greeting meant to open anything, just acknowledgement. He nodded back. That was all. Later that week, he saw her again at the dock. She sat on a low bench near the end, notebook open on her lap, pencil resting across the page. She was not sketching the boats. She was writing measurements, numbers spaced evenly, occasionally pressing the pencil harder to make a darker mark. The tide moved beneath her boots, steady and unremarked. Caleb stood at the railing a short distance away. He did not look at her notebook. She did not look at his watch. The harbor filled the space between them with its usual sounds. Ropes creaking, water tapping against wood, a gull calling from farther out. A man unloading crates glanced at them both, then returned to his work. Two people sharing the same quiet did not register as unusual here. The detail that marked Iris's safe was not dramatic. It was how she treated interruptions. When a delivery truck blocked the narrow street outside her workshop one afternoon, she stepped out, assessed the angle, and moved a crate herself to clear space. She did not ask for help. She did not refuse it either. She made room, then returned inside. When someone brought her a jacket with a torn seam and asked if it could be fixed by morning, she examined the fabric carefully and said it depended how it was worn. No promises. No performance. Caleb noticed that she never asked questions that required answers. She did not ask where he was from. She did not ask how long he planned to stay. She did not ask what he did before this place, or what he intended to do next. Their exchanges, when they happened at all, stayed practical. At the library, she waited for him to finish turning a page before passing through the narrow aisle. "Morning," she said once. "Morning," he replied. Nothing followed. At the coffee shop, she took her cup black and sat by the window. Caleb sometimes stood at the counter until his was ready, then took it outside. When the timing overlapped, he took the chair across from her without asking. He did not pull it closer. He did not fill the space. She did not explain what she was working on. She did not define the silence. If someone had been watching, they might have mistaken it for distance. It was not. It was permission. One afternoon, while walking the coastal path, the wind shifted sharply and fog rolled in fast, swallowing the curve ahead. Iris slowed and stopped, adjusting her jacket, eyes on the place where the path disappeared. Caleb stopped beside her, not close enough to crowd. "Visibility drops quickly here," he said. She nodded. "It lifts just as fast." They waited. When the fog thinned again, they continued walking, not side by side, but near enough to register each other's presence. The seals were there again that day, resting on the rocks. Iris sat without comment. Caleb sat too. No one claimed the moment. In the evenings, they sometimes ended up at the same small bar near the harbor. Not together. Just there. Iris ordered soup instead of a drink. Caleb sat at the far end, hand around a glass he did not finish quickly. They left at different times, but not hurriedly. If someone had asked Iris who Caleb Rowan was to her, she would not have had an answer that fit neatly. He was not a project, not a mystery, not a question waiting to be solved. He was someone who stayed within his own lines. And if you have ever worked late in a quiet town or walked the same road at the same hour often enough to recognize footsteps without turning around, you might recognize how that kind of presence feels. It does not demand entry. It does not rush departure. It stays for as long as it is allowed and no longer. Someone in town noticed this eventually, noticed the way the man and the woman occupied the same spaces without claiming them. Noticed how nothing needed to be clarified for that to work. The noticing did not spread. It settled. And in a place that understood how to let people be where they were without pulling them closer or pushing them away, that was enough for now. Iris remained what she had always been, a familiar figure, a safe presence, a companion in passing. Nothing more was required. The first contact did not happen between them. It passed through someone else, the way many things did here, without ceremony. Late afternoon settled over the town with its usual restraint. The fog had thinned but not cleared, leaving the air damp and cool. Sounds softened at the edges. The harbor moved steadily. No urgency, no pause, just continuation. Iris called or locked her workshop and turned the sign to back soon, then started toward the repair and hardware shop 2 blocks down. She carried a folded jacket under her arm, the fabric worn thin at the shoulder. Inside the shop, the bell rang once. Shelves leaned slightly with age. The smell of oil and old wood lingered. A radio played low behind the counter, more habit than sound. Caleb Rowan stood near the back, looking through a shallow tray of brass screws. He had already chosen what he needed and was comparing 2 sizes by feel rather than sight. The shop owner had stepped away to answer the phone. Iris stopped just inside the door when she saw him. Not startled, just registering. She waited until he shifted slightly, then spoke. "Excuse me." He stepped aside without comment, giving her room to reach the counter. She placed the jacket down carefully, smoothing the sleeve once. The owner returned and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Seam came loose," Iris said. "Along the shoulder." "Reinforced or just closed?" the owner asked. "Reinforced," she replied. "It carries weight there." Caleb glanced at the jacket then. The tear was small, clean, the kind that happened over time. The owner looked at him. "That yours?" Caleb nodded once. Iris did not look at him. "I can fix it by tomorrow," the owner said. That works, Caleb replied. The exchange ended there. The owner carried the jacket toward the back room. The radio crackled briefly, then settled again. The bell over the door rang as someone passed outside without coming in. A pause followed. Not awkward, just unassigned. I did not charge for the stitching, the owner called from the back. Since she pointed it out, Iris shook her head. Put on my tab. Caleb turned toward her. You do not have to, he said. She met his eyes briefly. I know, nothing more was added. They walked out at the same time. Outside, the light had thinned toward evening. The road curved toward the water, darkened by mist. Somewhere down the block, a door closed. A gull cried once, then went quiet. They stopped near the steps. I am heading toward the dock, Iris said. So am I, Caleb replied. They did not coordinate pace. They walked. The dock was quieter now. Most boats were in. Nets hung still. The water moved evenly, catching what little light remained. They stopped near the railing, a few feet apart. Iris rested her hands on the wood, feeling the grain beneath her palms. Wind is shifting, she said. Yes, Caleb answered. Nothing followed. After a moment, she spoke again. They usually bring the fog back around dusk. He nodded. It does not last long. They watched the water until the first layer of mist rolled in, softening the horizon. I should get back, Iris said. Of course. She turned, then paused. If the shoulder gives again, she said, bring it by earlier. That fabric responds better before it stretches. I will, Caleb replied. She left without waiting. Caleb stayed at the railing a while longer. If someone had been watching, they might have expected more. A question, a thank you spoken more clearly, something to define the exchange. None came. Nothing had been offered that required return. Nothing had been taken that needed explanation. The contact had passed through another person, through a jacket, through a task that needed doing. It did not ask to become anything else. By the time Caleb turned away from the water, the fog had returned just enough to blur the dock lights. The town held its shape. The evening continued. Some interactions here were like that. Warm enough to register. Light enough to move past. And sometimes that was all the connection a place required. The first shift did not announce itself. It arrived the way most things did here, without warning, without anyone stopping to name it. The morning opened gray and narrow. Fog pressed low against the harbor, leaving only the nearer shapes intact. Pilings, rope, the edge of the dock. Everything farther out existed by sound rather than sight. Caleb Rowan reached the pier early, before the boats fully stirred. A crate sat half out of line near the edge, its corner angled toward open space. The rope beside it had been looped once and left loose, as if someone had meant to return and did not. Caleb stopped. He looked at the crate, then at the water beneath it. He did not call out. He did not scan the dock for permission. He lifted the crate, shifted it back into line, and set it down so the base rested flat. He took the rope and finished the coil, hand over hand, until it held its shape. When he stood again, the dock looked the same as it had before, except that nothing leaned. He walked on. A fisherman working a few yards away glanced over, then returned to his net. No comment. The sound of the water filled the space where a response might have been. Later that morning, behind the diner, a delivery arrived early. Boxes crowded the narrow passage by the back door, forcing staff to step sideways to get through. Someone muttered once and went inside. Caleb picked up the nearest box and carried it in. Then another. He stacked them where they belonged and stepped aside before anyone addressed him. Thanks, the cook said, already turning back to the stove. Caleb nodded once and left. The town did not pause. By mid-morning, the pattern repeated. A loose hinge at the post office door no longer scraped when it closed. A chair at the bar stopped wobbling. A board near the bus stop bench lay flat where it had lifted before. Each adjustment landed quietly, absorbed into the day without remark. No one gathered. No one praised. The response was not gratitude. It was acceptance. At the workshop, Iris Calder worked with the window cracked open just enough to let air move through. Fabric lay across the table, chalk lines faint but exact. The heater clicked on and off, never quite catching up. She did not know about the crate. She did not know about the hinge. She knew the light shifted earlier now, and that one sleeve still pulled wrong no matter how many times she adjusted it. When she stepped outside for air, she saw Caleb across the street. He was kneeling beside the old bench near the bus stop. One slat had split down the middle. He held a thin brace beneath it with one hand and tightened a screw with the other. The movement was slow, deliberate, finished. Iris watched for a moment. She did not cross the street. She did not call out. She went back inside. The bench held. Someone sat on it later without knowing it had almost given way. That afternoon, Iris went to the grocery store. She passed Caleb in the produce aisle. He was lifting a case of bottled water onto a lower shelf that had sagged slightly. The store owner stood nearby, arms crossed. "You do not have to do that," the owner said. Caleb slid the case into place and stepped back. It's better this way," he replied. The owner looked at the shelf, then nodded once. "All right, no discount," was offered. No comment followed. Iris reached for apples, choosing the smaller ones, firm, with fewer marks. She did not look at either of them again. By evening, the bar near the harbor filled with its usual quiet crowd. Nothing special, just people who knew where to sit. Caleb took a stool near the end and ordered soup. He ate slowly. At the next table, a chair leg wobbled. He stood, crouched, and tightened the bolt beneath it. The couple barely noticed until the movement stopped. "Better," one of them asked. "Yes," Caleb replied. He returned to his seat. Across the room, Iris sat with her back to the wall, a bowl of soup cooling in front of her. She had come in cold and tired, looking for heat more than company. She noticed the chair only because the room went briefly still around it. She looked at Caleb. He did not look back. Her reaction was not what the town might have expected. She did not soften. She did not approach. She did not smile, thank, or acknowledge him on behalf of anyone else. When he passed her table on his way out, she spoke without turning. "You will strain your wrist if you keep using that screwdriver at that angle." He stopped, turned slightly. She continued, still looking at her bowl. "The handle is worn. It slips. Use the one with the wider grip." He nodded. "All right. That was it. No pras. No surprise. No attempt to shape what he was doing into something else." He left. The town settled into night. Fog rolled in thick enough to soften sound. Lights blurred. Footsteps faded sooner than expected. At the dock, someone tripped where a rope might have been. It was not there. At the workshop, Iris worked later than usual. The heater clicked. The fabric warmed under her hands. Outside, the bench at the bus stop held steady under the weight of a man, waiting for a ride that would be late. No one spoke of the man who had fixed it. The shift was not that Caleb worked. It was that nothing changed because of it. The town did not elevate him. It did not resist him. It did not turn his actions into charity, or obligation, or story. It simply allowed them. And Iris did not respond the way he might have expected either. She did not step closer. She did not pull away. She corrected a detail and returned to her work. The next morning, fog loosened its hold just enough for shapes to return. Boats emerged one by one. Sound followed. Caleb walked the dock again. A crate sat crooked. This time he passed it. Someone else noticed and adjusted it later, slower, with more effort. The dock held either way. At the workshop, Iris opened later than usual. Not delayed, just unhurried. Caleb passed the window. The light inside was on. She did not look up. By midday, the town had absorbed the new shape of things. Caleb still moved through it. So did Iris. The difference was not closeness. It was expectation. The town no longer waited to see what his actions meant, and Iris no longer responded as if they required response. Work remained work. Distance remained intact. Nothing was solved. Nothing was named. And in a place that understood how quickly meaning could harden into something unhelpful, that restraint mattered. The first shift settled into the grain of the day, quietly, without permission, without applause, and the town continued, exactly as it always had, with one small adjustment it did not need to explain. The tension did not arrive as an event. It settled into the spaces where something might have happened and did not. Morning moved through town with its usual restraint. Fog thinned and gathered again, never fully leaving. The harbor stayed calm. Sound carried farther than expected. then softened without warning. At the coffee shop, Iris Calder stood at the counter with her hands resting lightly on the wood. Steam rose from the machine and disappeared into the low ceiling. When her cup was set down, she thanked the barista, lifted it, and shifted one step to the side. Caleb Rowan stood behind her. Their eyes crossed for less than a second. Not held, not avoided, passed. Iris turned toward the window and took her usual table. She did not open her notebook. She watched the street instead, where a pickup rolled past and vanished into fog. Caleb ordered and waited. When his coffee was ready, he took it outside. The chair across from Iris remained empty. No one reached for it. No one claimed it. At the dock later that morning, they stood on opposite sides of the same railing. The tide was coming in. Small pieces of driftwood bumped against the pilings and drifted away again. A seal surfaced once, breathed, and disappeared without sound. Iris leaned forward, hands on the rail, shoulders squared. Caleb stood back, weight even, eyes following the line where water met land. Neither spoke. The quiet stretched, not uncomfortable but exacting, the kind that asked attention without asking for response. A fisherman passed behind them with a coil of rope. He glanced once, then continued. Two people sharing the same view did not register as unusual here. Iris shifted first. She stepped away from the rail and adjusted the strap of her bag. Her eyes moved toward the path that led back into town. She paused long enough to be seen, not long enough to invite comment. Caleb did not move. She turned and walked away. That afternoon, the workshop door stayed open, though the air was cold. Iris worked near the back table, fabric spread wide, chalk lines faint but precise. The heater clicked on and off, never quite settling. Through the front window, movement passed and dissolved. A figure slowed, continued. Caleb did not come in. Across town, he sat at his small table with his notebook open. The pen rested between his fingers. The page stayed blank longer than usual. He closed the notebook and set it aside without turning the page. That evening, the grocery store filled briefly, then emptied again. Iris stood near the bread shelf, comparing two loaves that looked nearly identical. Caleb entered from the far end of the aisle and stopped when he saw her there. He waited. She chose one loaf and placed it in her basket. She turned. This time their eyes met fully. Neither smiled. Neither looked away immediately. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning," Iris replied. The exchange held, then released. She passed him without slowing. Caleb picked up the loaf she had put back, examined it briefly, then returned it to the shelf. He chose another. At the bar near the harbor that night, fog pressed low against the windows, blurring the lights outside. Iris sat alone at a table, a bowl of soup cooling in front of her. She stared into it without eating. Caleb entered quietly and took his usual stool near the end. They did not look at each other. The room filled with small noises. A spoon against ceramic, a chair scraping lightly, someone coughing once and apologizing to no one. Iris lifted her spoon and took a bite. Then another. Caleb finished his soup and stood. As he passed her table, he slowed. Not enough to stop, enough to be noticed. "You fixed the bench well," Iris said, still looking at her bowl. He paused. "It needed it," he replied. She nodded once. That was all. He left. The door closed behind him with a sound so soft it barely registered. Outside, fog thickened, pressing gently against faces and buildings. Iris stepped into it a few minutes later, pulling her jacket closer. She took a breath that showed briefly, then vanished. Across the way, Caleb stood near the water, hands in his coat pockets, looking toward where the horizon should have been. The ocean sounded closer now that sight had receded. He stayed longer than necessary. The fog did not lift. If someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the way both of them paused more often now. Not to wait, just to allow the moment to settle before moving on. At the coastal path the next morning, their timing overlapped again. Iris walked ahead, jacket zipped high, hands free. Caleb followed at a distance that neither closed nor widened. Their footsteps found different rhythms on the damp ground. At a narrow bend, Iris stepped aside to let him pass. Caleb stopped instead. "You can go first," he said. She shook her head slightly. It is easier if you do. He stepped ahead, careful not to brush past her. The moment passed cleanly. Farther on, the path widened. Fog lifted in thin streaks, revealing the water in pieces. A seal rested on the rocks, unmoved by their presence. Caleb stopped at the railing. Iris continued a few steps, then paused. She turned back. "You usually stop here," she said. "Yes," Caleb replied. She hesitated, then joined him, leaving space between them that did not need to be measured. They stood without speaking. Wind pressed lightly against their backs. Salt and wetwood carried through the air. A gull cried once and went quiet. The stillness held long enough for breath to slow on its own, long enough for shoulders to settle without instruction. After a while, Iris stepped away. "I'm heading into town," she said. "All right," Caleb replied. She walked on. He stayed until the water shifted and the light changed, then turned in the opposite direction. The tension did not break. It aligned. It lived in glances that acknowledged and released, in distances kept with care, in words used only when they fit the space they entered. By evening, the town resumed its inward pull. Lights came on behind windows. Fog returned. The harbor breathed evenly. Iris locked her workshop and took the long way home. Caleb walked the shorter route and then turned back halfway, as if correcting a step without comment. Nothing was named. Nothing was resolved. But the space between them had weight now, and it held without collapsing. The town noticed, not as story, but as rhythm. And in that quiet interval, where breath found its own pace and nothing asked to be decided yet, the day settled enough to continue. The shift did not arrive with agreement. It arrived with a choice that did not ask to be confirmed. Morning moved in with thinner fog than the day before. The harbor showed itself in pieces. The road along the water curved and disappeared, then returned again a few hundred yards later. Nothing announced a change. The town kept its pace. Caleb Rowan reached the coastal path just as Iris Calder came into view ahead of him. She was walking toward town, jacket zip high, hands free. He slowed without stopping, the distance between them closing only because the path narrowed. They reached the bend at nearly the same time. Iris stepped aside, then stopped. "You can go," she said. Caleb shook his head once. "After you." She considered this, then stepped forward. He followed, leaving a careful space that did not need to be measured. Their steps did not match. They did not try to make them match. At the widening near the overlook, Iris stopped again. The water lay below them, flat and gray, broken only by slow movement near the rocks. A seal surfaced, breathed once, and disappeared. The wind carried the smell of salt and wet wood without urgency. Caleb leaned on the railing. Iris stood back from it. "I am heading into town," she said. "Yes," he replied. A pause followed, not waiting, just unfilled. "You can walk with me if you want," she added. "Or not." Caleb looked toward the road, then back at the water. He nodded once. "I will walk part of the way," he said. They turned together. For the first time, their steps aligned for more than a few seconds. Boots on damp ground, wind moving through low grass. A truck passed below, tires hissing, then faded. They did not speak as they walked. The town drew closer without pressing. Doors opened and closed ahead of them. A radio played somewhere, then went quiet. At the split where the path met the street, Iris slowed. "I turn here," she said. "So do I," Caleb replied. They continued for 1 block. At the hardware and repair shop, Iris stopped. "I need to go in," she said. "I will wait outside," Caleb replied. She shook her head slightly. "You do not have to." "I know," he said. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then wait," she said. He did. The bell rang once as she went inside. Through the window, Caleb watched her speak with the owner, hands moving in small, exact gestures. She pointed once, listened, nodded. The exchange ended without emphasis. She came back out with a paper sleeve folded once. "Thank you for waiting," she said. "Of course," he replied. They stood on the sidewalk while the street moved around them. Someone crossed behind. A door closed across the way. The light shifted, thinning the fog just enough to show the curve of the road. "I will walk from here," Iris said. Caleb did not step forward. "All right," he replied. She took 1 step, then stopped. "This is enough for now," she said, not unkindly. He met her eyes. "Yes." She turned and walked away, her pace steady, not quickened. Caleb remained where he was until she disappeared into her workshop. He did not follow. He did not leave immediately either. The space had settled into a clearer shape. Later that afternoon, the dock filled briefly, then emptied again. Ropes were coiled. Nets were lifted and set aside. A crate was shifted and left where it belonged. Caleb passed through without stopping. Inside the workshop, Iris worked behind the glass. The light inside was warm against the gray outside. The door was closed, but not locked. The sign read open. Nothing asked to be decided. That evening, fog returned earlier than expected. The water darkened. Lights came on and stayed on a little longer. Caleb walked home by the longer route. Iris locked up and turned the sign. They did not meet again that night. If someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how the distance between them did not shrink or widen. It clarified. The option to stay had been offered. The option to step away had been honored. Neither required explanation. In a town that understood how to leave room without withdrawing it, that small trust held. The road remained open. And for now, there was no need to answer yet. The town did not pause after their decision. It adjusted in smaller ways. Late afternoon brought a wind that moved unevenly through the streets, lifting damp leaves and setting them down again a few feet away. Doors stayed open longer than usual. Voices carried, then dropped. The harbor kept its steady motion, unchanged by any of it. Caleb Rowan walked past the service road near the dock when he heard the scrape. Metal against stone. Then silence. A pickup had stopped with its tailgate down. A younger man stood on the bed, shifting a crate toward the edge. One corner slid faster than expected. The weight tipped. For a moment, the shape of an intervention appeared. Caleb stepped forward. Not quickly, just enough to be present. The crate slid another inch. The man braced himself and caught it alone, boots planted, arms tightening. The crate wobbled, then settled back into place. "I have it," the man said, breath short but steady. Caleb stopped where he was. "All right," he replied. He stepped back. The man secured the load and jumped down. He nodded once, already turning away, and drove off. Dust lifted, then settled back into the same shallow grooves it had been in before. Caleb continued on. Nothing followed him. Across town, Iris Calder was closing her workshop when a woman from 2 streets overstepped inside, holding a cracked ceramic planter. Soil leaked through a split along the side. The piece had been fired thin years ago, long before Iris worked here. "It broke when I moved it," the woman said. "I thought you might fix it." Iris turned the planter once in her hands. "It will not hold water again," she said. "I know," the woman replied. "It just needs to sit." Iris nodded. She reached for a strip of linen and wrapped the planter carefully, binding the crack without hiding it. The line would always show. The piece would stand, but it would not be whole. She set it aside and wrote a single word on a tag. "Bind. No restauración. No promise." Just enough. That evening, the wind picked up along the block. A loose sheet of tin rattled on a nearby roof, lifting at one corner. The sound traveled sharply down the street. Caleb heard it and stopped beneath the eave. He looked up. The corner lifted again, caught by the gust. He reached toward the ladder, leaning against the wall. Then he stopped. The ladder was not his. A man came out of the house below, already pulling on gloves. He climbed quickly and secured the tin before the wind shifted again. The sound ended. Caleb stepped back into the shallow shade and walked on. Inside the workshop, Iris stacked finished work on a shelf near the window. One pile leaned slightly. She considered removing a piece to balance it. Instead, she slid a folded cloth beneath the stack and shifted the weight by a fraction. The shelf held. She turned off the overhead light and left the smaller lamp on. Outside, the fog thickened and blurred the street. When it thinned again, Caleb was passing, already moving on. He did not look up. Later, at the bar near the harbor, the room filled and emptied in its usual pattern. Caleb sat at the end of the counter with a bowl of soup. A man 2 stools down knocked his glass with his elbow. Liquid spread across the wood, creeping toward Caleb's sleeve. Caleb lifted his arm and shifted back. The bartender wiped the spill before it reached him. Sorry, the man said. It is fine, Caleb replied. He did not help clean. He did not comment. Across the room, Iris stepped inside briefly to drop off the bound planter for the woman who would collect it later. She paused when she saw Caleb at the counter. He did not look up. She placed the package behind the bar, exchanged a few words, and left. The door closed softly behind her. They did not cross paths. Near the edge of town, a streetlight flickered, then steadied. Caleb adjusted his route to avoid the uneven patch beneath it. Iris, farther away, took the longer way around a block where water pooled after dusk. The motifs accumulated quietly. A crate that almost fell, a roof that nearly lifted, a spill that had not spread, a planter that would never hold water again. Each moment carried the shape of rescue, then released it. Courtesy passed through without remark. Nothing lingered long enough to become a story. By night, the fog settled low over the harbor. Lights blurred. Sound softened. The tide came in without urgency. Caleb sat on his porch and drank water slowly, measuring intake by habit rather than thirst. He listened until the wind eased. Iris shut down the workshop and walked home with her collar turned up, steps steady on the damp pavement. The near rescues did not complete. They were not meant to. They passed through the day like weather, confirming that things could hold without being saved, that attention could exist without claiming outcome. The town rested, and beneath it, the same quiet motion continued, uninterrupted. The consequence did not arrive as conflict. It arrived as a detail slightly out of place. On a gray afternoon, Iris Calder stood at the counter of the hardware and repair shop, waiting for change. The bell over the door had rung behind her a moment earlier. Boots crossed the worn floor and stopped. The owner slid coins across the counter, metal cool and familiar. Your friend was in earlier, he said, without emphasis. Iris looked up. My friend. The owner nodded toward the back room. The man with the coat. The one who fixed the bench. Iris gathered the coins and closed her fingers around them. He asked if the zipper came in yet, the owner added. Said he might come back later. She slipped the coins into her pocket. He did not need to ask. The owner shrugged. Just thought I would tell you. Outside, the wind pressed in from the water, colder than it had been that morning. Iris stood on the step a moment longer than necessary, collar turned up, eyes on the street without settling on anything in particular. Friend. The word did not echo. It did not ask to be corrected. It stayed where it had landed. Later that evening, Iris saw Caleb Rowan near the dock. He stood at the railing, hands resting on the wood, looking out toward the water as fog moved in low layers. The light thinned toward dusk. You were at the shop, she said, stopping a few feet away. Yes, Caleb replied. They mentioned you asked about the zipper. He nodded. I did. You did not need to. I know. A pause followed. The water moved steadily below them. They called you my friend, Iris said. Caleb did not react immediately. He looked out toward the water, then back. Did they, he said. Yes. That is not something I said. I know. No correction followed. No reassurance. The misinterpretation was acknowledged and left where it was. The next morning, Iris worked with the shop door closed. Not locked, just closed. The sign still read open, but the glass reflected more of the street than it revealed of the inside. The heater ran longer than usual. The sound filled the room evenly. Caleb passed the workshop that afternoon and noticed the door. He did not slow. At the grocery store, the owner greeted Iris by name and asked if she wanted the usual. She nodded. When Caleb entered a few minutes later, the owner mentioned the weather and nothing else. At the bar that evening, Iris chose a table farther from the door. Caleb took his usual stool at the end. They were not avoiding each other. They were adjusting. When Caleb stood to leave, he passed her table without changing pace. Iris watched the door close behind him, then returned to her soup. The consequence appeared again 2 days later. A delivery truck arrived late, blocking part of the street near the workshop. The driver struggled to maneuver a pallet jack over uneven pavement. Caleb approached and slid a board beneath the wheel, leveling it just enough for the jack to roll. The driver nodded and continued. From inside the workshop, Iris saw the motion through the window. She did not step outside. She finished the seam she was working on and pressed it flat, the iron hissing softly. That night, fog came in thick and early. Iris chose the short way home. At the bend where the path narrowed, she saw Caleb ahead. He stopped when he noticed her behind him and stepped aside, offering space. She passed without comment. Neither of them turned. Nothing had been said that needed to be taken back. Nothing had been done that required repair. But one wrong detail had been repeated once, and that was enough to shift the weight of things. The town continued as it always did. The bench held. The fence stayed steady. The fog lifted and returned. Between them, something adjusted its line. Not breaking, not resolving, just finding a new way to hold. Not farther apart, not closer, clearer. And for now, that clarity was allowed to remain. The realization did not arrive as a conclusion. It arrived as an omission. The morning opened without emphasis. Gray light moved across the harbor in slow bands, neither bright nor heavy, just enough to show the water where it met the dock. Caleb Rowan woke before the light reached the window. The sound of the tide was steady, close enough to register, distant enough not to demand attention. He stood, crossed the room, and opened the window. The air carried salt and cold. It settled on the skin and stayed there. He waited a moment longer than usual before turning away. The kettle went on. Coffee followed. The routine held its shape, but the order had shifted slightly. He poured water before grinding the beans. He let the coffee steep longer. When he sat by the window, the mug cooled in his hands without being lifted. On the table, the notebook lay open to a blank page. Caleb looked at it. Then he closed it. Outside, the first fishing boat passed without drawing birds behind it. The water smoothed itself again. He rinsed the mug, set it upside down, and put on his coat. He did not take the most direct route toward town. The longer road followed the curve of the coast, away from the shop windows and the early foot traffic. Fewer people passed there. Fewer places asked him to pause. The wind came in harder along that stretch, carrying mist that blurred the line between road and water. At the post office, a hinge caught briefly, then released. Someone had already adjusted it. Caleb stepped inside, mailed a small package, and stepped back out without stopping to look around. When he reached the center of town, the morning had settled into itself. Doors opened and closed. A truck idled, then moved on. The grocery store lights flickered once, then steadied. The workshop door was open. Iris Calder stood inside, near the work table, hands dusted lightly with chalk, attention fixed on fabric cooling beneath a folded cloth. The empty hook in the window remained where it always had. The light inside was warm against the gray outside. Caleb slowed. He did not stop. Inside, Iris noticed movement at the edge of the glass. She looked up in time to see his reflection pass and dissolve as the light shifted. She did not step toward the door. She did not call out. She returned to her work. At the grocery store, Caleb chose bread and apples and one packet of mineral salts. He took his place in line without scanning the room. The clerk rang him up and slid the receipt across the counter. Outside, the wind picked up, pressing damp air against the street. Caleb adjusted his coat and turned away from the workshop again. The sound that followed him down the block was familiar. Metal, a loose rattle, something catching where it should not. Caleb stopped automatically. Then he stayed where he was. The sound resolved on its own. Someone else had already secured whatever had shifted. The rattle disappeared, absorbed back into the town's low hum. Caleb did not move toward it. He continued walking. Later that afternoon, he sat on a low wall near the edge of town where the road dipped and the view opened to water. The light thinned and spread evenly, flattening color. He stayed longer than planned, not waiting for anything to happen. Across town, Iris adjusted her schedule. She erased one note on the board and shifted another to the following day. The chalk left a faint trace. She did not wipe it away. When she stepped outside to lock up, she saw Caleb farther down the street, walking away from the workshop rather than toward it. The direction registered. Nothing followed. The next morning repeated the pattern. Caleb took the longer route again. He passed the workshop after the busiest hours, when the street had already thinned. He did not look in. Iris saw him anyway. Her hands did not pause. At the diner, Iris sat near the window. Caleb took a seat at the counter instead of the stool 2 spaces away. He ordered and waited. When Iris stood to leave, she paid and turned slightly toward the door. "I will head out," she said, to no one in particular. Caleb nodded without turning. Outside, she walked toward the workshop. Caleb waited before leaving, then headed in the opposite direction. No one commented. The town adjusted around the new spacing the way it always did. Quietly, without explanation. In the afternoon, Iris stood at the window and adjusted the display. Not the fabric, the light. She changed the angle by a fraction so the glass reflected less of the street. The interior became clearer from inside than from out. She stepped back and considered it. The hook remained empty. Across town, Caleb repaired a loose strap on his bag. He tightened the buckle, tested it once, and set the bag aside. He did not consider where he would carry it next. Evening came with the usual restraint. Fog rolled in. Lights came on behind windows and stayed on a little longer than expected. Caleb walked past the workshop once more that night. The lights were on inside. Iris stood at the table, posture steady, hands moving with measured precision. She did not look up. Caleb slowed. He stopped. He did not step closer. Iris felt the pause and looked up. Their eyes met through the open space. Not searching, not waiting. She nodded once. He returned the nod. Then he stepped back and continued on. The choice was complete. Not to approach, not to insert himself, not to occupy a role the town had not asked him to hold. Iris did not follow him with her eyes. She finished the seam she was working on and set it aside to rest. The kiln schedule remained unchanged. The next day followed the same pattern. Caleb moved through town with fewer pauses. He noticed what needed doing without acting on all of it. Some things were left as they were. Others were already handled. The town did not diminish because of it. Nothing fell apart. Iris worked with the door open longer, then closed it earlier. The sign stayed the same. The order of her day shifted without affecting the work itself. They crossed paths on the coastal road that evening. "Evening," Iris said. "Evening," Caleb replied. They passed without slowing. If someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the change. Not in distance. In accuracy. Caleb no longer measured his place by usefulness. He moved when needed. He stayed when not. The town did not require more. Iris respected the choice without marking it. She did not open the door wider. She did not close it to define anything. She left it exactly where it was. The harbor breathed. The light moved and moved on. And somewhere between the routes taken and the ones avoided, a role settled into place without needing a name. The town did not comment. It did not need to. It simply continued, leaving enough space for things to remain unfinished, unclaimed, and allowed to be what they were for a while longer. Morning returned without insisting on anything. Gray light spread across the harbor in a thin layer, even and undecorated. The water moved the way it always had, lifting and settling against the pilings with a patience that did not belong to anyone. Fog lingered offshore, not committed enough to come in fully, not willing to leave either. Caleb Rowan woke before the light reached the window. The room was the same. The chair by the glass. The kettle on the stove. The sound of the tide arriving and withdrawing in slow measure. He opened the window and let the cold air in, then closed it again sooner than he used to. The coffee came next. He prepared it the same way, but not in the same order. Water first, then beans. He did not sit while it steeped. He stood at the counter instead, hands resting flat, eyes on nothing in particular. When he carried the mug to the window, he did not take the chair. He leaned against the wall and watched the light change shape across the water. The mug cooled without being lifted. When he drank, it was already past the point of heat. He left the notebook where it was. Outside, the coastal path held its damp curve. Grass bent under moisture and stayed there. Pebbles pressed into the dirt in the same places as before. The seals rested on the rocks, bodies close, unmoved by his presence. He sat on the driftwood again, but not as long. Cold reached him sooner. He stood and walked back toward town without waiting for it to deepen. At the dock, the rhythm was familiar. Ropes creaked. Nets hung stiff with salt. A man called out once, then stopped. Caleb watched the work without stepping in. A crate sat slightly askew. Someone else adjusted it before he reached it. He nodded and continued on. The diner door opened and closed. Coffee poured. Plates slid across the counter. Caleb took his usual seat, then moved one stool down without thinking about it. He ate. He paid. He left before the room warmed. At the grocery store, he picked up the same items: bread, soup, apples. He did not reach for the mineral salts this time. The shelf remained full behind him. The library stayed cool. He returned a book and chose another from a different shelf, one he had passed many times without stopping. He did not check the due date when he left. The church doors were open that afternoon. He sat on the back pew again. Wood, light, stillness. The order of it felt familiar without holding him in place. When he stood to leave, he did not linger at the threshold. Across town, Iris Calder unlocked her workshop and turned the sign. The space looked unchanged. The table held the same marks. The window caught the same light. But she began with a different task than usual. She cut fabric before adjusting the lamp. She pressed a seam before checking her notes. The work did not resist. She stepped outside once, breathing in the damp air, then returned without scanning the street. When she adjusted the window display, she moved the fabric last. She corrected the light first. The hook remained empty. The card stayed where it was. At midday, Iris went to the coffee shop. She took her cup and chose the table by the window, as she always had. Caleb stood at the counter behind her. When she turned with her mug, their eyes met briefly. Neither smiled. Neither looked away too quickly. She sat. He took his coffee outside. The chair across from her remained empty, but it no longer asked anything of the room. Later, they crossed paths on the coastal road. Iris walked toward town. Caleb walked away from it. The wind pressed in from the water, cool and steady. They slowed as they passed. Evening, she said. Evening, he replied. They continued on. The order of their days had shifted, not in direction, but in sequence. The same places held them. The same routes remained available. The meaning had changed quietly, the way light changes on water without altering the tide. That night, Iris worked later than planned, not because she needed to finish, but because the work held. When she locked up, she did not look for anyone on the street. Caleb walked the long way home again. He closed the shutters earlier. He drank water slowly. He did not step outside when a sound carried down the block. It resolved without him. The town stayed as it was. Fog rolled in and out. Lights came on and went dark. The bench at the bus stop held steady. The repaired fence along the path remained firm. Nothing marked a milestone. Nothing asked to be named. Two routines returned to their shapes, altered only in order, not in substance. The places stayed familiar. The days continued. Maine remained quiet. And within that quiet, the people moved differently now, not because anything had been added, but because something no longer needed to be done. Part 13, Open Loop Ending the Town did not change its mind. Morning continued to arrive the way it always had, without asking for attention. Light spread thinly across the harbor, revealing the same docks, the same road bending along the coast, the same windows that showed little unless you were already close. Fog came and went on its own schedule. The water kept its steady pace. Caleb Rowan stood near the edge of the pier one evening as the light thinned. Not waiting, not searching, just there. His hands rested on the rail. A boat passed farther out, engine low, leaving a line on the water that smoothed itself away almost immediately. Across town, Iris Calder turned off the lights in her workshop one by one. The warmth from the day lingered in the wood and fabric, releasing slowly. She adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped into the street, choosing the longer route home. The road curved. The sound of the water followed. They did not meet that night. They did not need to. The bench at the bus stop held. The fence along the coastal path stayed firm. The bar near the harbor filled and emptied as it always did, stools taken and freed without ceremony. The church doors stood open some afternoons, quiet inside, wood and light doing their work without instruction. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been lost. What had changed was not the town, but the way it carried its people. Work mattered because it was done, not because it was seen. Distance could mean respect as often as it meant space. Presence did not require explanation to be real. Caleb returned to his routines with one fewer gesture, and nothing collapsed without it. Iris continued her work without filling every gap, and the forms still held. The town adjusted around them quietly, the way it always did, making room without comment. There was no conclusion to announce, no promise made, no direction closed. The road remained open in both directions. Some evenings a light would stay on longer than expected. Other nights it would not. Someone might pause outside a window. Someone else might keep walking. Both would be allowed, and the town would remain there, steady and patient, holding space for whatever order came next. If someone happened to notice and chose to stay with that noticing a little longer, the town did not object. It simply continued, leaving the door where it was.